Welcome to the Sherman Report. Here's Peter Sherman.
And good evening. Many people around the world have had their opportunity now to commemorate the terrible events of October 7th, 2023, each of us in his or her own way. Where I live, in Toronto, 40,000 people filled an outdoor space at the city's Jewish Community Center. They lit candles, they heard from speakers, political and non-political. They listened to music, met hostages and families of hostages. It was a splendid and incident-free way of sharing grief and sorrow with others. It was important, but just a part of an agenda we may not have developed yet, but that we may have to pay attention to going forward. In different parts of Toronto and in Canada's two other largest cities, Montreal and Vancouver, one could be forgiven for thinking that Israel initiated these events. It did not. However, there are too many who are willing to ascribe the October 7th attacks by Hamas as justifiable because of the supposed mistreatment of Gaza-based Palestinians over many years. It just isn't so. Any more than one's supposed rage over it should lead to smashing windows, resisting police, or threatening citizens in downtown Montreal. In 1948, Israel declared itself a state and was immediately recognized by the United Nations, which had sanctioned the partition of what was at that point known as British Mandate Palestine. Israel's War of Independence began that day with attacks from all countries surrounding it. And over the ensuing 76 years, there have been major wars and many, many minor skirmishes, intifadas, if you will. Israel has always prevailed, but Israel has been in a position, an unenviable position, to have to spend more on defense per capita than any other nation or face certain annihilation. The real question might be, do you prefer to be demolished by missiles and bombs or demolished by your own economy? The memorials are over now, but the fighting continues and the Jew hatred does too, unabated and around the world. Later in the program, I'll have an interview with a knowledgeable Canadian named Rick Ekstein. Rick had traveled all over the Middle East for 20 years while building his business. He will tell you about how wonderful relationships between supposed rivals were formed back then. But he'll also be talking about what he's seen in the 4 trips he's made to Israel since last October. The feelings gleaned in talks with members of the Knesset, cabinet ministers, military personnel, and just plain Israelis who only want their lives back. Speaking for myself, I've developed a sense of concern, maybe even foreboding, and perhaps out-and-out worry about our own country during the past year. I feel that not all of our leadership is with us in Canada, that some prefer to pay lip service or say nothing at all. Here's a clip from our parliament yesterday. I'll let you be the judge.
A year ago today, a sadistic and genocidal death cult, Hamas, carried out the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust and has 100 more hostages. Bring them home. Here at home, though, our Jewish friends and neighbors have been doubly victimized as anti-Semitic mobs take to the streets shouting, "From Palestine to Lebanon, Israel will soon be gone. There's only one solution: intifada, revolution." Will the government clearly and unequivocally condemn these genocidal chants from hateful mobs on our streets?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Judy Weinstein, Vivian Silver, Ben Mizrachi, Netta Epstein, Shir Georgi, Alexandre Luc, Idal Vital Kaploun, Tiferet Lapido. May their memories be a blessing. It was my honor to have met with their families here at home and in Israel. And on the anniversaries of Hamas' horrific attacks, my promise to their loved ones is the following. Year after year, Canadians will honor their memories, and to Jewish people, we stand with you. We won't relent until the last hostage returns home.
The Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
She does relent every single day, just like her leader. I asked a very simple question. Mobs have taken to the streets in front of Jewish homes, hospitals, and businesses to shout anti-Semitic hate slogans. I quoted a number of them and invited the minister to rise to her feet and specifically condemn them, to stand with Jews against the anti-Semitism that has been allowed to proliferate on our streets. So once again, will she condemn these anti-Semitic chants?
Yeah. The Honorable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, today is October 7th, an anniversary of a horrific attack on Jews. 1,200 people killed, over 200 people taken hostage. Our solidarity is with Jews in Israel and with Jewish people in Canada and right around the world. What we stand up against absolutely is the amount of hatred that we have seen in this country and countries around the world, where people will target Jewish Canadian schools, daycares, and synagogues for the acts that they have a problem with on another side of the world. We are better than that in this country. We need to stand up against that kind of hatred in support of Jewish people and in place of all people who defend their ability to worship how and whom they choose.
We watch videos, all of us do, that bring us the reality of what's going on in the world. Basically, instead of a news person telling you something, you get to see and hear it yourself. And then absorb what you see and determine what it is you've actually witnessed. In Vancouver yesterday, there were demonstrations, and one in particular caught my eye. Here is a clip that shows you in under a moment that some people, notably younger people, have chosen a path that has upended our Western way of thinking. The young woman doing the speaking explains that when revolution is desired, it can be achieved. She points to the paragliding terrorists of last year in Israel as shining examples, but listen to what she says can be accomplished beyond that, and then to her calls for death to the three powers she hates.
Do not wonder how revolution could possibly be done. Men who have never known a free day, who have lived their entire lives under the thumb of one of the most powerful settler colonies in the world, built paragliders to fly over a wall so high that it blocked out the sun when you stood underneath it. Do not wonder how revolution can be done. We must do it. Death to Canada, death to the United States, and death to Israel.
Now tell me, is that sedition? Is it incitement to riot? Is it hate speech? I don't know. I'm not from the legal side of things. I just look and I think, could it be? But I didn't see anybody policing it. So I say to you, viewers, listeners, and friends of the Sherman Report, that we cannot stand by decrying the events that occurred in Israel a year and a day ago. It did not and does not stop there. And ultimately, this will not be particular to Jewish people. We have to think about the origins, yes, because that's what's happening in the Middle East right now. And it won't subside at this point or anytime soon, I don't believe. It will expand. The speaker in that last video clip was clear. Death to Canada, death to the United States, and death to Israel. Sadly, I believe the responsibility for the radicalization we've seen in the streets, but particularly on college campuses around the world, is rooted somewhere other than in our homes. We of another generation have worked hard to raise our kids with what I believe are good values. Perhaps the people who we've relied upon for years to guide them in a similar manner for the bulk of their school days, the majority of their days, period, right up to and especially in our colleges and universities, had different ideas. I'm not seeking to lay blame anywhere. If you are a parent, you share in this responsibility. But however you choose to interpret what's happened in our society, the October 7th, 2023 events have ignited a fire that now envelops the world and will likely dictate how things will be when the next generation fully assumes power and control. I believe we need a full investigation and a full review of our society in Canada as it exists and would exist, and I believe that this must be done at the highest level and as soon as possible. If not, there will come a day, mark my words, in the not too distant future, when we might discover that no one is safe. No one is safe because people who think differently decide to enforce their beliefs on the rest of us. Back in a moment.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
Hi again. I have a friend who spends quite a bit of time in Israel and a lot more on the Middle East situation in general. You've met him before here on the Sherman Report. Rick Ekstein is a businessman who spent about 20 years doing business in almost every Arab country in the region without any problem. He's an activist. He advocates for Canadian military families as a matter of ongoing routine. Rick is a proud first-generation Canadian, son of Holocaust survivors, and he spent the past year supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism here in Canada. He's just returned from his fourth trip to Israel, meeting with the IDF's spokesperson office, members of the Knesset, foreign ministry diplomats, released hostages, families of hostages still being held in Gaza, and just ordinary, exhausted Israelis. Rick graciously joins us to share some of what he's learned. Welcome, Rick Ekstein. Good to have you with me.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here again.
All right. I took a look at the last conversation we had a couple of months ago because I wanted to see how, in your mind, things had changed. You had just come back then, and you've just come back now. And I guess you could say things have progressed. And I don't use that in a positive sense since then, but not in a good way. You told me the world had no backbone and that you feared we were losing Western democracy. Do you feel the same way today?
I think more than ever, Peter. Look, at a year ago, let's just spend 30 seconds. Hamas invaded Israel, killed 1,200 people, including 800 civilians, captured 250 more, took them into Gaza, released some of them. I've talked to some of them. They were gang raped multiple times, men and women. I saw pictures of what they did on October 7th a year ago, dismembering people. I saw pictures that I will never, ever forget.
Well, you can't unsee them.
And there are people celebrating that in the streets today. And then you look at what's been happening in Lebanon the last little bit, where where Israel is fighting Hezbollah. Hezbollah is guilty of killing close to 500 Americans, if I'm not mistaken, over various times in the Middle East, going back to the 1983 Beirut bombings of the Marine barracks,
Yes.
the Embassy Annex bombings, the Khobar Towers, and many other things. I think there were 7 or 8 people on the FBI's top most wanted terrorist list that Israel has killed over the last week or 10 days. And is the world saying thank you? No, the world is celebrating what these terrorists are doing. Israel is fighting the battle of Western democracy on behalf of the West, and yet they're being condemned for it.
Western democracy is not only something that is looked at and aspired to. In the case of this situation, it's looked at and hate is hurled towards it. What about the hate that exists in our own streets about what I guess the large collective we are supposedly doing? Are we committing a crime? They seem to think so.
I heard an interesting theory last week that the world was a bipolar world for many years, the Russians, the Soviet Union, and the Americans. Then it became a unipolar world, the Americans, and there was world order in both of those. Whether you liked it or not, there was order. Right now, you've got Russia, China, and Iran who are doing everything possible to sow world disorder as opposed to order. And what's interesting is that what we used to call our right are gravitating to Russia, to Putin, to that strongman type leadership. And we've seen that in France and other places. What's really hard for me to understand is that the left seems to be migrating towards Iran, which I really, not 110% do I understand that. But if you look at the Democrat Party in the States, if you look at the Liberal Party here in Canada, if you look at the Western university professors and people like that, they are siding with Iran. And then the third part, which was told to me, was that the center, the business people, are gravitating to China because that's where the money is. I get that one, and I get the right. I'm really having a tough time understanding the left gravitating to Iran, but I see it every day.
Well, I don't understand it either, and I'm going to tell it's a different why for me. I have a number of friends and people I've become acquainted with. They describe themselves as Persian. They like to call themselves Persian, and I don't blame them because Iran's not a nice word, not to them, not to us these days. So they tell me they're Persian, but they're Iranian, and they're so happy to be in Canada, and they all are connected to friends and often relatives back in Iran. And it seems to me like Iran is something that if they could, they'd change by overthrowing the mullahs and change it back to a great version of what it once was. Maybe without the secret police of the Shah, but certainly with the freedoms to participate together in going to university, being educated. There are a lot of educated older Persians here. Women who were able to go without a hijab if that's what they chose, to wear jeans if that's what they chose, to get an MD if that's what they chose. No longer. Those things are not allowed anymore, and people here would like it changed. So I'm going on a bit. I guess Jews and others are very, very worried even here in Canada. And you've said that an incipient World War III is already underway. You told me that last time, but that you don't think the West really gets it yet. Is this what we're talking about?
I think so. Part of the problem is that the last time the West has had real victory to the end, I think, is at the end of World War II, when Germany and Japan surrendered unconditionally. If you look what's happened since Korea, it was containment. It wasn't total war. They didn't allow General MacArthur to do all the things he wanted, and we ended up stalemate. Look where we are. Vietnam, same story. I can fast forward to the Ukraine, where the West was very slow in giving arms to the Ukraine and still isn't letting Ukraine fight with one arm tied behind their back. And then you look what Israel's been doing for the last 20 years, and whether it's because they've been part of that same philosophy or whether the West has forced them, they've been containing Hamas, they've been containing Hezbollah, and they've been containing Iran. Yes, they killed some scientists, they mess with the centrifuges, but it's just a policy of containment, and these countries are just getting stronger and stronger. Maybe we just need to get back to this old stage of total victory and end some of these regimes.
It strikes me that has a lot of merit in mulling it over. I mean, if we don't, this is going to go on ad nauseum. And I think the things that we see happening here on our streets are going to be replaced by things that we don't even want to consider. So let me keep it with the Middle East for now. I'm wondering how much blame you would place on Netanyahu, because he's loved in some quarters and hated depending on who you talk to. But you've told me that he should have taken earlier skirmishes or intifadas the distance and cut off the head of the snake before it became a monster. And you also correctly predicted for me right here and in print that we would see a progressive situation, because the last time we spoke, it was just Gaza, just Hamas, but we would see Hezbollah come into it. Of course, that's come to pass. And ultimately Iran, and I know we don't want to think about it, but we know they're there, and we know that that's a simmering and about to come to a boil cauldron. I'm sure you still feel that way, but how is it going to unfold? And do you think Americans will get into that fight?
It's a very good question, Peter. I think 30 years from now, the Americans in the West will say thank you to Israel, because Israel is fighting their battles on their behalf right now. Whether the Americans will get into their fight right now, I don't know. There's an election coming up in the next 4 weeks. That could change everything and anything. Netanyahu could feel he has nothing to lose by going strong after the election, or he could feel he's better off to wait based on who's going to be the president until they are the president. So I don't know. I can't predict what America is going to do. I think they should be supporting Israel. I think they should be thanking Israel for knocking off people who are on their most wanted list for killing 500 Americans. I think they should be supporting Israel in dealing a knockout blow to Iran's leadership, so that you don't have a North Korea situation, what is it now, 80 years later. I think they should. I don't know if they will.
Well, one of the things, frankly, that keeps me up at night is the likelihood that I'll wind up dying at a ripe old age, and I mean that, and that I'll never have seen Israel in a peaceful and serene way. I was born a year before Israel was, and I was one of those kids who took nickels to school to buy leaves for trees in the Canada forest. I mean, that's what I remember about Israel. And I thought, what a peaceful place it must be. And having been there a couple of times, there are times when it has been that, but never, never, never letting its guard up until October 7th of last year. Look, can the world act here in unison? Because if I look at what is laughingly called the United Nations, I tell myself, no, it can't. And my fear, I think, mirrors the fear of a lot of people. And that is, you just mentioned when the states will thank Israel in 30 years. I won't be here in 30 years, but I fear for Israel existentially, and whether it will be here in 30 years. And my Jewishness tells me it has to be.
So, I talk to people a lot about that with politics here. That's my second passion.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the fact of the matter is, whether the Liberals or the Conservatives are in power, Canada 30 years from now will still be here. Might be a little bit better or worse. And the same with the states, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, will still be here. I can't guarantee you that Israel will be here in the form that it is today, on the one hand. On the other hand, listen, we've been around for 5,000 years. We have suffered some of the most heinous crimes in history. We're still here. I think you know this number, Peter. Before World War II in 1935, 36, there were 16 million Jews in the world. Today, 75 or 80 years later, we finally made it back up to 16 million Jews again. So will we survive? I guess that's what we do as a people. We survive.
Well, we have no choice. We have to.
Yes.
And I think, I've done some editorializing the last little while, as you would expect. And one of the things I say, I always use the phrase never again. And I make it clear that the days of Jews walking willingly into crematoria are a distant and terrible memory. It's never going to happen again. So we've got to see to it that in 30 years, my kids, grandkids, get a chance to enjoy Israel the same way I did. But let me ask you another question. I was listening to an American broadcaster this morning, and the talk was of the fact that the countries we're looking at, the countries that Israel is engaged with, are countries that make nothing except war. Gaza makes nothing. You can't name a product that comes out of Gaza. Hezbollah it's not even a country. It sits there in a piece of Lebanon. It makes nothing. Iran, you could say Iran makes oil. No, Iran pumps oil, but it doesn't make very much. You don't see anything that says made in Iran. These countries seem to exist only to hate Jews. That was what the conversation was about. Do you agree with that?
The facts, as you laid them out, would certainly make you feel that that is true. Look at when Israel left Gaza in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, they left, amongst other things, 1,000 acres of greenhouses. Can you imagine what that looks like? 1,000 acres of greenhouses.
I know.
unbelievable business of exporting flowers globally. And they walked out and they said to the Palestinians, here, it's yours. They broke every single pane of glass in all of those greenhouses. Yet they unbelievable tunnel makers. Look what comes out of Israel. Things that save the world, things that allow us to communicate better, drugs that save us. It really is.
All the shots that they administered in Gaza a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, including the shots that they administered in Gaza. So It really is strange, and it's hard to understand why the Western world is not supporting one of the most productive countries in the world, countries that contribute to science, to the arts, to math, culture, and they're siding with countries that, to a large degree, as you said, they're only hatred and terror. There's something wrong with this world. I think it starts with the woke movement that has facilitated all of this so well, but there is something really, really wrong with this world.
Well, I'll bring it to a close and make this point and let you react to it. I've spent a lifetime being a strong and allegiant Canadian, like most of our viewers, listeners, but I've also kept Israel in my heart. That's how I separate the two countries and how I categorize them. I think a lot of people are like that. So talk to our audience a little bit about being a Jew in Canada and seeing events, and very particularly like those in downtown Toronto and Montreal over the past weekend. I have to believe that they're reminiscent of what my dad saw when he lived in Germany in 1930. Really? Am I correct, or am I overstating? And if I am correct, how do we address it?
So let's start with, I am first generation Canadian, as you mentioned. My parents were Holocaust by a Catholic priest in her family, and she was found after the war by an aunt who was saved.
Rick, can I ask you to lean in a little bit towards your microphone?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know there's good people out there. Without a Catholic priest in his family, my mother wouldn't have lived. Without Mr. Schindler, my aunt wouldn't have lived to find her and bring her here. So I'm a very proud Canadian, and I'm proud to have grown up here. I'm not thrilled with everything I'm seeing in the streets at the moment, but I do not believe that's the majority of Canadians. I'm spending a lot of times talking to non-Jews, to Christians, telling them my story about my mother and getting nothing but sympathy from them. Today, it's the 1-year anniversary. I'm getting texts and emails from friends, not Jewish friends, all over the country, who are saying, be strong, I'm with you today. So yeah, Peter, we're seeing some shadows of 1938. I refuse to believe that this represents the view of most Canadians. I refuse to believe that we're going to be led into gas chambers. I think that saner and calmer heads will prevail, but I think we've got a lot of work in front of us to educate them as to why they should.
I really think we do. I think you're right. And Rick Ekstein, I want to thank you because you've done a little bit of that education with me tonight. And so on behalf of the audience, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter.
Okay.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
Thank you for joining us for this Day After program. I promise tomorrow we'll broaden the topic scope, see if we can laugh a little with Stephen LeDroux. And for now, I'm Peter Sherman, wishing you a very good evening.
The Sherman Report, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the video version at YouTube, Facebook, and always at petersherman.com. Thanks for listening to the Sherman Report. If you'd like to connect with Peter directly, just go to petersherman.com.